everyone. Thank you for joining us on the Getting Started with Kubernetes Part 1 first series, or first part of this series that we're running in partnership with Mirantis. With me, I've got Nick Chase, which is the Director of Technical Marketing and Development Relations at Mirantis. So Nick is a former software developer and author and co-author of more than a dozen books on various programming topics, including the OpenStack Architecture Guide and Machine Learning for Mere Mortals. So he's going to run the session. If you've got any questions, do put them on the chat. Well, we're going to do it at the end of the session. If we've got time, Nick is going to answer them. But I'll let you start, Nick. Trying to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Maria. Well, you did such a great job. That's besides, I don't think they care about me. They came here for the content. So let's talk about what that's gonna be. Let's kind of start with making sure you're in the right place. Nothing like thinking you're going to Chicago and winding up in Brazil. So this webinar is, I'm going to assume that you have a basic understanding of how Kubernetes works. You understand that there are containers and pods and you know what it does and all that. We're not going to concern ourselves with sort of the internals of Kubernetes today, but we are going to talk about YAML, which is used to sort of define these objects for Kubernetes. That's going to be our focus for today. So we're going to start out with, well, what is YAML and what is it for? And then we'll go into sort of the basic structure so that you can recognize it and you can recognize the different pieces and what are they for and all of that. And then we'll go into the different data types. Ooh, a little too fast. Then we'll go into the different data types. Since, you know, this being programming, you want to be able to know how to do that. And then I'm going to go over a bunch of tools that are useful when you're writing YAML and using it and so on and so forth. All right, so let us move right along. So uses for YAML. So YAML is in many situations all over the web and all over the internet. You've almost undoubtedly used it even without realizing it. If you are a programmer or an operator, it's used for configuration, it's used for templates. Let's kind of take a look at how some of these things sort of manifest themselves, if you'll pardon the pun. So for example, on Kubernetes, we may define what some of these objects are. Like here, we're defining a pod and we're defining all of the information about it. And we'll go into more detail about these structures. For Swarm, same thing. You can see we're defining version and what are all the different services that are in this Swarm application. OpenStack uses it for heat templates. So you might define a heat stack with a YAML document. Even outside of those systems, if you go down into more of a, well, you know, what if I just want something simpler? So I'm not, Ansible, as you know, is more of a deployer or a scripter, an automator. It also uses YAML for its configuration. Same thing with Maven. This just looks like a bunch of just a bunch of values, but that's also YAML. So we're going to talk about all of that stuff. Now, what is it that makes it a YAML document? You may have noticed that there was really no specific vocabulary. All of these, oops, wrong direction. All of these use different vocabularies. There's no artifact ID in an Ansible playbook or in an OpenStack heat stack. You know, there's no heat template version in a Swarm configuration. There's no specific vocabulary that makes something YAML. Instead, it's all about formatting. And we're going to go over the different aspects of formatting that you need to know when you're doing YAML. And the idea behind that is it's predictable. So a YAML parser understands what it is you're trying to do based on the formatting that it finds. Okay. Some programmers, you're going to be used to that. Like in Python, you need to make sure that you indent properly so that the parser knows what you're doing and so on. It's the same thing. Okay, so let's talk about overall YAML structure. All right, so here we have a very, very simple YAML document. This is as simple as you can get. Just associative arrays. So we have a name and a value. Another name, this name happens to be name, another name, and a value. You can have as many of these as you want. Now notice, I want you to notice here, see this colon here? We're using colons to distinguish between the name and the value. But because there's a space here, that space is required. That's how the parser knows that this is a name. Okay, so we got name, colon, space, and then the value. So we can have a colon in the value. There's no space here. So the parser knows, oh, okay, that's not part of the formatting. Now, here is a very important part of YAML that a lot of people don't realize. YAML is what's called a superset of JSON. Okay, so for example, I could do this whole document, well, I can do any YAML document in JSON. Okay, I can do other things besides JSON, as you can see, but so if you're more comfortable with JSON, you can always just stick to that. But most of the YAML you're going to see around the web is going to be in this sort of simplified form. So you want to understand how it works. So these two are exactly the same. Okay, we have one object with two name value pairs. Okay, all right. Now, what happens if you want to have nested values? So in this case, we're looking at a pod definition, but we have a bunch of name value pairs. That's all that's on here is name value pairs. But in this case, some of the values are themselves name value pairs. So for example, the value of the metadata is this name equals pod example pair. Okay, the value of spec is the array of all of these name value pairs. Okay, and notice here that we're also kind of combining the straight and JSON formats, which we can do. There's no problem with that. So here we have a JSON array as the value for the arg's name. All right. Oh, main thing here is the most important thing, which I almost went on without, must have this indentation. That is how we know that these are nested. Okay, so it doesn't matter how many spaces you use. You can use 1, you can use 12. Most people use 4 or 2. The only important thing is you must be consistent. If you start out with 2, 2 it is. Okay, you can have multiple layers, that's fine, but you must be consistent. Okay, now sequences. Sequences would be when you have multiple values for a single name. So in this case, we have one name and multiple values, and those multiple values are signified by having a dash. Okay. You can also indent this. It works the same way, but you don't have to. The dash itself indicates that these are nested below this name. So if you have more than one value, that would be a sequence or an array. Either way, but in YAML, it's called a sequence. All right. Multiple objects in a document. Now, here is something that you have to keep in mind. First off, normal people, what we call a document is, say, a file. Okay. So in this case, we have two objects, two Kubernetes objects in a single file. All right. Now, this is all terrific. The way that we separate them is by using these 3 dashes. Okay, 3 dashes separates these objects within a single file. Now, YAML actually refers to each of these as a document. Okay, so we have multiple documents in our document. Why? I don't know. I didn't make it up. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just here to tell you. So if you have multiple objects or documents within a document, you can have as many as you want. Just separate them with this 3 dashes indicator. Okay. Comments, can't have programming without comments. So you can specify them with a £, same as in many other languages. Notice that these comments are neatly indented. You can really screw yourself up by having comments that are all cattywampus, and then all of a sudden it's not working, and you know what's going on. So make sure that your comments are in the right place. Okay. All right. Data types. So YAML has a bunch of sort of built-in data types. And a lot of these are things that you would normally think to use. Okay, so strings, obviously, just text. Maps, dictionaries, these are the name value pairs that we were talking about before. Okay, so this is a map. Okay, all right. Integers, floats, booleans. We're going to see examples of a lot of these data types in a few minutes. Well, less than a few minutes. You can have base 64 data. You can also have binary data in a YAML file. So even though YAML files are just straight text, you can write them with whatever you want. You know, Vim, VI, Notepad, Crayon, doesn't matter. You can have binary data that can then be read by a program. Sets and lists are sequences, like we saw a little bit earlier with the dashes. You can also do like timestamps. So we'll see an example of timestamps a little bit later on, and even hex values. There's a couple of different types of values that we'll see as we go forward. So what I've done is I've put together a simple Python file so that we can see this in action. So how would we read a Python file? First thing is you want to go ahead and what you do not want to do is go ahead and completely screw up your whole presentation. That's bad. Don't do that. What you want to do is go ahead and install PyYAML. I mean, you can use any other library if you want to. This is just the one that I'm using. You can usually do that through pip or pip3, depending on how your system is set up. And then once you do that, you can create a Python script that imports that package and opens the file. Okay, in this case, I have the full path to my file, and creates this reference F as the file for the file. And then what I'm doing is I'm going to load all the documents. Remember, documents are individual objects within a single file. You can check the documentation for the PyYAML package if you want more information, but basically what we're doing is we're loading everything that's in that file using the full loader. Again, there's different loaders. It's not important for us right now. If you're interested, go and check the documentation. So once we have this array of docs, all we're going to do is we're going to loop through the docs, and for each one, we're going to print out. So we've got the name and the value, okay? And we're going to print the name, the type of the value, and the value, so that we can see how that all worked out. So for example, let's get out of this right now. We'll pop back into non-presenter mode. And if I were to come over here, so I've got my, excuse me. So I've got my list here. I've got my file. All right. And if I were to take my data file, which I should open up. Let's see here. What you guys cannot see is that the Zoom interface is in my way. Okay, let's see here. There we go. Or not. Recent. Tell you what we're going to do. We're going to say, we're going to call this, live. This is how you know it's a live demo, folks. So we've got a new file. We're going to call it live. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to grab just this data. Okay. Well, if the gods of technology will allow me. There we go. I'm going to save this as live.yaml. YAML files, by the way, can be YAML or YML by tradition, doesn't matter which. So let's take a look at what we've got here. So we've got here different values. I've got a list here. So list, sequence, whatever you want to call it, of 2 values. I've got a string. Let's see what happens when I run this file here. Okay, so I can come here and I can say Python types.py. And it would help if I use the right value, the right version. So Python 3 types.py. Okay, so let's see what we got. So if we come over here, there we go. All right, so let's take a look at what we have. So we've got our sequence, and the Python script recognized, okay, this is a list. It gave it says, yes, it's a list, and it gave it to us as a list. So programmatically, if I were just loading this YAML file, I could work with this as a list, as a Python list. That would be no problem. Now, here's the interesting thing that you got to keep in mind. So I've got 3 different versions of one here. Okay, I've got one as a string, one as an integer, one as a float. I didn't do anything special in this document, but they were recognized correctly anyway. Okay, so this sort of auto typing is something that is available to you, but you need to make sure that you do it properly. And it can also trip you up. And I'll show you how in a minute. We also can have a dictionary. Okay, so dictionary, map, whatever. In this case, it's coming up as a dictionary. And again, there's your JSON array. All right. Now, if we go back and we look at some other data types, let's look at something a little bit more complex. So if I were to come back here and drop into my live file some other text, let's look at that. Okay, so if we run this again, make it a little neater. Okay, so if we run this again, let's take a look. So here I have a hex value. Okay. Well, I have a name value pair. I have a map, and the fact that it starts with 0x tells Python, or in this case, the YAML module, that it is actually a hex value. So it's going to come up as an integer with the integer value of this hex value. Okay, so 4824 in hex is actually 18,468 as an integer. Now, we're kind of used to this 0x, that, you know, it's a number, but, you know, the fact that there's an x there draws our attention. But here's another one that you got to keep in mind. Octal. We are, you know, as creatures who have 10 fingers and 10 toes, we work in base 10. Okay, so 0 through 9, and if you get beyond 9, you put a 1 in the tens column. However, YAML also recognizes octal values, base 8 values. And the reason that and the way that it knows is if it just starts with a 0. So here we have an octal value. Octal 10 is actually an integer of 8. Now, this is much easier to get screwed up by, because if you say, oh, well, I've got a 3-digit number or a 5-digit number or a 12-digit number, and I'm just going to put, I'm just going to make sure it's always that many digits by padding it with leading zeros, you're going to screw yourself up. So be careful. Okay, so dates, it'll recognize a date automatically. You can see we've got date time here. Now, Booleans are a little bit weird, okay, because Boolean, they try and be very flexible with Booleans. You can see here, we've got 3 different ways: off, on, true, false, yes, no. Note that it depends what version of YAML that you're working with. Version 2 of YAML and version 3 of YAML treat yes, no differently. I don't want to get this wrong. I believe that yes, no is a Boolean in version 2, but not version 3, and not the other way around. I could be wrong, could be the other way around. But point being, be careful if you're going to use yes, no. All right. And also note that you can turn what would normally be numerical values into strings by just putting quotes around them. Okay, so this was recognized as a string, even though before that same number was recognized as a float. Okay, now let's see what we have next. IS, data types. So now there is a way that you can tell YAML, or what you're processing YAML with, how to treat your data. So clear this and run it again. This would work better if I save the file. Okay, there we go. Now, so we do that by specifying the two exclamation points and the type. So here we're specifying a binary. Okay, so we're saying, okay, this string here is really a binary. So when we look at it, you can see here it comes up as bytes. Okay. Same thing here. Here we have, this would normally be treated as an integer. We can say, no, we want that to be a float. Okay, as you can see here. Or we can say, all right, I'm going to put a string around this, but it's not a string, it's actually an integer. And this, by the way, remember what we talked about with octals and leading zeros. This is one way you can get around that problem. So you could basically enclose it in a string and say, no, it's really an integer, or it's really a float, or whatever. Okay, so the last part of data types that I want to talk about is how to handle strings. This is something that comes up a lot. Normally, if you were to have just some random information here in this nested after example, it would be an error. So, if I were to take this out, let's do that. Again, save the file, Nick. There we go. Or not. Okay. Well, it's not an error, as it happens, which answers the question that we normally get later on. All right. So you'll notice here that both of these strings went in. One of them came out modified and the other one did not. Okay. So here I noted this with a pipe, and you'll notice that all of the line feeds were preserved without all of these indents. Okay. But for this first text, the line feeds were not preserved. Another way to do that is with the greater than sign. Okay. So if I were to run this again, what we would get is same thing, only with a line feed afterwards. Okay. All right, so that's the difference. If you want to preserve your line feeds, preserve your spacing, etc., use the pipe. If it doesn't matter, use the greater than. Okay, coming back to our presentation. We're coming towards the end of the actual presentation part, and we'll look at some tools. So this is an example of some of these things in play when you might want to use this. So for example, in a ConfigMap, you might have all of these values, and you can specify what you want them to be. Now, another thing to show you here, well, again, stop doing that. Notice there's a period here. You can put periods in these names. So if you're using like class names or something like that, you can do that. All right. And then secrets are another place where YAML is very often used, and a place where you would want to specify the data type. So say, okay, this is actually the base 64 version of this text, so it's not in there in clear text. All right. Finally, there are a myriad of tools that you can use to kind of simplify your life when it comes to dealing with YAML. Okay, I've listed a bunch of them here. You can get the slides, so you'll have these URLs. There are just tons and tons and tons and tons of different YAML projects, as you can see here. There's also a lot of online tools. Okay, online YAML tools, JSON formatter. So, for example, if I were to, well, you can see a lot of the examples here. I'm not going to put it here. So basically what this will do is it'll take your sort of verbose YAML and condense it into minified JSON, which can be useful in a lot of different situations. But you get the idea. You've got a lot of different tools that you can use. You can look at the actual YAML library. There's a ton of them here. So for example, you remember I went and I installed PyYAML. Okay, well, there's a bunch of other YAML tools that I could have used. If maybe you're not using Python, maybe you're using, Rust or Haskell or whatever. So YAML.org, very useful for finding what you need. All right. Let me see some other things that are particularly useful. Oh yes. Okay. So YAML lint. A lot of times what happens is you've got a YAML file, there's a problem with it, and you can't figure out what the problem is. So what you can do is drop it in here, and if it's, it'll tell you where the problem is, basically. So it'll also clean it up for you. Language converter. This can be very useful. So for example, if I wanted to use my YAML files, my YAML objects as other objects. So for example, if I wanted to use it as a Python object, I could easily do that with this converter. And now I've got a Python object that I can manipulate. Okay, so that's pretty useful. They do a bunch of different languages: Python, Go, C#, and so on. So you get the idea here. So that would be Python right there. Let's see. And strict YAML is actually it's exactly what it says. It's a restricted subset. So there's weird things about YAML that make it really kind of loose and easy, which is terrific unless you're actually trying to parse it, and then, you know, it can be a problem. So you have you have all of those options. All those things are available to you anytime that you want them. All right, so we have some time left. If you are ready for questions. Do we have questions, Maria?
We have 2 questions. Yeah. In the meantime, if anyone else can think of questions, there is a chat in the Q&A box as well. So feel free to put your questions there.
That's right. Ask me anything. I can't guarantee I'll answer it, but you can ask me anything. Okay. So what have we got, Maria? I just realized I can't look at the sheet because I'm sharing my screen.
Okay. So Alexander asked if there's a possibility to have another YAML file included, like #include in C.
Yeah, everybody asks that. There is not within YAML itself, but you could sort of create your own annotations to do that within the program that you're using to parse the YAML. So that said, there are tools. It depends on the tools that you're using. So for example, there's a tool called Customize. So like if you're doing this for Customize, if you're doing this for Kubernetes, Customize actually has that capability built into it. So you'll have like a directory where you have all the files that you're going to use, and then you have a sort of master file that says which files to grab, and you can override values and things like that. So I would suggest that you take a look at Customize. Like I said, particularly if you are using Kubernetes, but I actually don't think that Kubernetes is a requirement. Don't quote me, but I think that you can, yeah, there you go. Available as a standalone binary for extension and integration into other services. So Customize is very useful. So I definitely would go ahead and give that a try.
Cool.
Next.
Thank you. He's also asked if sequence and set/list is the same as data types.
They are the same. Yes, they are the same. Basically, when you are talking to people who are YAML people, they'll call them a sequence. But when you are pulling them up in a particular language, then that language may change what it's called. So, so as far as YAML is concerned, it's a sequence, but as far as Python is concerned, it's a list, because Python doesn't have sequences, it has lists. So that's why there's this sort of discrepancy.
Thank you. Also, which is the more appropriate for YAML, Go or Python?
Whatever you feel like. Whatever you feel like. Yeah, I am not wading into any kind of religious war here. If you are a Go programmer, then Go is way more appropriate. And if you're a Python programmer, Python all the way. I happen to be a Python programmer because I'm always one language behind. I didn't know Python when I got into OpenStack. By the time I learned Python, I was into Kubernetes, and now I haven't learned Go. So there you go. It doesn't matter. Every language you saw at YAML.org, every language has some sort of library for it. The important thing to actually note here is if you're looking for a language that's appropriate for YAML, probably you want to go with the ones that are best at handling object-like structures, okay? Because essentially that's what it is. Okay, it's basically you're defining an object, even if it's a small object, but it can be a very large object, a multi-level object. So there you go.
Thank you. Another question, are there any special types or advices or best practices for URLs in YAML?
There is not a special type to the best of my knowledge. You know what? Let's find out. Let's find out, and whether, I don't believe there is, but let's do an experiment. The nice thing about Python is, nice thing about YAML rather, is you really can't hurt anything. You can't break anything with it. So let's see what happens if we were to just put in a URL here. Let's see what happens if we run it. Yeah, it just came up as a string. So there's really no specific type. I didn't think there was. But you notice we did not have to enclose it in quotes. You might want to, you don't have to. So there's no particular best practices when it comes to using URLs.
Thank you, Nick. I think that's all the questions we've got.
That's all the questions that I answered. Did I cover everything so thoroughly that nobody's got any other questions?
Of course.
Not even anything about the meaning of life or Kubernetes or, you know.
Are they two related then?
Depends on your life. If they are, you got to really seriously consider your work-life balance, I think. All right, so if we have no other questions.
Yeah, we'll finish here. Thank you so much, Nick. It was really great having you on board and listening to you. Meantime, if everyone has any questions, feel free to email either Maria at Nuaware or Nick or marketing.
Yeah, so my email is nchase@mirantis.com. You can also get me at Nick Chase on Twitter.
There you go. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.